My name is Eileen Conran Folks, and I serve as the manager for Stockton's Kramer Hall. So on behalf of the president and our provost, Dr. Harvey Kesselman, we welcome you. This is our second lecture, and lucky for us, they both happen to be from our very distinguished guest, Pat Martinelli. Pat is the curator of the Vineland Historical and Antiquarian Society, which is the oldest historical society in New Jersey, founded in 1864. She's a native of South Jersey of Italian descent and has a large extended family on both sides of her family tree. After college, she spent years working as a reporter for local newspapers, covering everything from entertainment to criminal cases at the county courthouse. She states that while she was fortunate enough to have people who honed her passion for the written word, she eventually drifted out of newspaper business and into the world of museums. Since 2003, Pat has written 9 nonfiction books, some of which I'll name: The Fantastic Castle of Vineland, Haunted New Jersey, Ghost and Strange Phenomena of the Garden State, True Crime, Pennsylvania, the state's most notorious criminal cases. That sounds like a good class for Stockton. And again, the Big Book of New Jersey Ghost Stories, all of which are available on Amazon.com. Pat, again, as I mentioned, served as Kramer Hall's inaugural lecturer in the fall of 2013 and presented a very clever and historical journey from the road from Hamilton to Vineland. And today, Pat has come back and graciously offered to present her second lecture entitled A Stitch in Time, which will highlight the contributions of Italian-American women who worked in regional clothing factories, including one just as in the building we are in, the National Garment Company, during and post-World War II. On behalf of Stockton, please help me give a warm welcome to our guest lecturer, Pat Martinelli.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate you folks taking time out of your day to come out. I'm glad we got a nice day and not a rainy or snowy one, that's for sure. Where do I begin? I'm not going to go into a whole history of the Italian community in South Jersey, because then we'd be here for about a week. And if I do tend to wander off, I'll try and make sure you still hear me. Fortunately, after almost 20 years in the museum field, I've developed what I call a museum voice. So I'm generally heard across the room, whether the person wants to hear me or not. But the reason we're here today is to take a look at a very specific segment of South Jersey history. The Italian women and their daughters who worked for many years in the clothing industry in South Jersey. But before we go into that, we're going to look a little bit at their predecessors, the people who came here first, the Italian immigrants between 1880 and 1910, who came to America in search of a better life. It wasn't always possible. It didn't always work out as they expected. But for many of them, it was definitely a new beginning and a fresh start, a chance to experience a better life than they had known in the old world. The ones who came to New Jersey were primarily from southern Italy and the island of Sicily, or this portion, I should say. That I'm sure there are a smattering of northern Italians still in this area, and I'm not intending any slight at them. But the ones that I'm looking at are the ones who came from the districts of Abruzzi and Campania, Basilicata and Calabria, as well as the cities of Naples and Palermo. These men and women had essentially been forced from their homeland because the poverty level was heartbreaking in those days. It was a case of leave or don't survive. They were the subject of brutal landlords who pretty much treated them like serfs. They had no rights. They had no opportunity to own anything, which is why you have to understand that for them to come to America, often with nothing much more than the clothing on their backs, and to be able to own even a fraction of the ground that was there, was an opportunity that they could not miss. So they made the journey despite the hardships, traveling in the steerage holds of steamships that took weeks to get across the ocean sometimes. To them, it was the opportunity of a lifetime, and they weren't about to let it go. They were drawn here by people like Charles Landis, who pretty much advertised in their own countries, in their own language, and said, come to America. There is opportunity here. Somewhere in my family holdings are letters that Mr. Landis wrote to one of my grandfathers, but unfortunately they got buried away in somebody's attic and have not yet surfaced. I'm hoping that someday they will. But it wound up, by the early 20th century, you had a population explosion here. The Italian population was approximately 50,000 people spread out through the 8 southern counties of South Jersey. And this was almost 10% of the existing population at that time. So as you can imagine, once they achieved ownership of the land and started sharing their roots or growing their roots once again in land that was actually theirs, they were determined to make it be a lasting experience. But like many European immigrants, the transition into America was not always a smooth one. The settlers weren't always welcome. In fact, there are newspaper articles from those early days that are listing after listing after listing of, oh, those Italians having knife fights and saloon brawls and all kinds of horrible things going on. But eventually, that time passed and they became more and more assimilated into their new land. They planted, they harvested, because farming is what they knew. And it wound up that they tried to encourage their children to give up their native languages because they felt this was a way for them to learn to be Americans, to be accepted as Americans. But at the same time, these people clung to one another. They said, you trust family. You trust your neighbors who you know came from your hometown. You trust the church. But outside of that, it was often a little bit difficult for them to reach out to other communities, even if the people were from a different town. I'd like to share the story of when I was in grade school, about 1 million years ago. I would come home from school and I would say to my parents, oh, I just met a new girl in school. She's a lot of fun and I'm going to have her come over to play. The first question either out of my mother's mouth or my father's mouth was, where are her people from? So as you can see, for a lot of us, the old traditions did cling on through the generations. But what happened was, those ways started to have to fall a little bit by the wayside as the children went to schools and met children from other backgrounds, different ethnic groups. They sort of did what the parents never dared to do, and they became more assimilated than the parents ever dreamed of. So one of the purposes of the paper that I wrote while I was in college was to look specifically at the women, because really the women's history for this particular time period had never been examined in any way, shape, or form. The women were always sort of shuffled off to the sidelines. And I think one of the best parts of being a student of history is learning to see past the stereotypes. Stereotypes exist for a reason. They're kind of a mental shorthand that we are all guilty of using in different points in our lives, just as a way to address given situations. But when you look past the stereotypes, you discover the stories of people who had lives just as we do now. And the details of those lives were rather interesting. This paper actually got its start, though, when one day I was sitting at the kitchen table, thumbing through the newspaper while my mother was putting away dishes. And I looked at this one obituary and kind of smiled and said, oh, isn't that a shame? I said, all they did was list this woman who had passed on as a homemaker. And my mother turned and she smiled at me and she said, well, what do you think they're going to say about me? And that kind of took me aback, because here was a person who I knew was extremely talented at so many things. And I thought to myself, I have to find a way to pay a little tribute to her life. So I went back to the days when she was freshly released from high school. This is the farmhouse where she grew up, which for many of these women was a familiar sight because they were from farming families. My grandparents owned a small farm in Landisville, 14 acres for many years. There were a lot of years when they couldn't even pay more than the interest on the mortgage, but they plugged away and they held on to it. And they had a total of 9 children. The older boys, for the most part, quit school by the time they were 15 to help support the family. My mother was one of 2 children out of the 9 who actually had the opportunity to graduate from high school, which even for the girls was a bit of a revelation, because really the girls were expected to marry and have children. That was their primary function in life. But my mother loved high school, and since she was a kind of a skinny, sickly little thing early on, my grandmother tended to indulge her. She was the oldest girl out of all the children. So she was able to go to high school, which she loved to do, because at lunchtime she got to put on music on the jukebox and basically spend her time dancing, which she continued to do for the rest of her life. In the sewing factories became the draw for many of these women because they were known as the needle trades. And the needle trades were not perceived by the men as a threat to the existing system of family life. Needle trades were something the women did at home. So if they had an opportunity to go out into the world and earn a little money, well, then that maybe wasn't such a bad thing. At the factories, they hunched for 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours, depending upon how much work was available, over sewing machines like the ones you see here. And if you'll notice the stacks of shirts in the background, this was their accomplishment. They took a lot of pride in seeing who could be the quickest, who could get the most work done. It wasn't solely because of the money, it was pride of accomplishment, which for them was a lot. It carried a lot of weight for them. And for a lot of these women, this was a way, yes, to help support their family. While the Depression had ended, and we were going to the movies to enjoy things like Shirley Temple singing her way into our hearts, Glenn Miller playing big band music that we could all jitterbug to, it was a case of work still needed to be done, and they weren't afraid to do it. So what I did for this paper was I talked to as many of these women as I could still find. Most of them are gone now, including my mom. But they shared with me their stories in a way that I found very interesting and entertaining. My mother, for example, being the 4th in a family of 9 children, she knew things were hard for her folks. It wasn't a case of they were denying her anything just because they felt like it. They were telling her the reality of what their lives was. They got by. And even with World War II jump-starting the economy, things were still hard. One of the things she wanted to do was go off after high school to Philadelphia to become a hairdresser, because she always loved clothing and hairdos and all that sort of thing. So she went to her father and she said, It'll only be $100. I can ride into the city every day with a woman that I know. Father said, we don't have the money. So she didn't whine and pout and go off and sulk in a corner. She just said, okay. She went to the nearest clothing factory and signed up to work for $10 a week. It was a mile from her house. She walked to work every day, regardless of the weather. And of that $10 a week in those early days, her father gave her 50 cents, and the rest went to support the family. She knew her parents, unlike some of the other people in the neighborhood, were not going to go into the factories themselves. They were pretty well intimidated by their lack of education. Her father had no schooling. He could read and write his own name. Her mother went up to the 4th grade, and that was the best that they could do. So she felt it was important to do her share, because that's what, to these people, was most important. The family was everything. And to help do your part to keep the family functioning was considered a sacred responsibility, whether you were male or female. Her sister Anna was the same way. Anna had to leave school at 16 because the preceding year she had had a burst appendix that cost $300. Imagine that. You can't get an aspirin in a hospital these days for $300. But the operation cost $300, and she knew her parents didn't have the money. There was no way they could pay that debt. So it wound up, Anna quit school, went to work, and found herself a new skill, working in the clothing factories. She didn't mind. She was proud of the fact that for the first time she was able to contribute to the household. In fact, she was so industrious that she actually managed to save enough money one Christmas to buy her parents a brand new set of living room furniture, which was so well built it actually lasted until, I would say, the early 1960s. So that tells you something about how things were made in those days. So she chose the sewing factory primarily because the only other closest option would have been Leggett's, which was a canning house, or working as a waitress, neither of which opportunity her father would have approved of. But when she told them she was going to leave school, she recalled it didn't bother them. They just said, oh well, if that's what you want to do. And that's what she did. Vineland resident Rita Dannenhofer, who grew up in Vineland in the late 1930s and early 1940s, said, we went to work because that's what they wanted. We had no choice in those days. They didn't believe in girls going to high school because they figured that your husband was going to keep you. Her brothers were encouraged to go, but then again, they didn't always make it through and wound up going to work too. Dannenhofer said that at age 16, there was a little clothing factory called Diaz Clothing right in Rosenhain, which was close to her house. It wasn't too small, but it wasn't a big factory either. They did train you a little bit. Then I went onto a machine or something, but at that point she couldn't remember what it was. Fanny Gorgo, who left school at 14, spent a few years at Leggett's canning house before she went to work at a local clothing factory. Unlike a lot of her contemporaries, she chose to get married and go back to work. She met Anthony Gorgo in 1935 and moved to DeRossi and Sons in Vineland, where she spent a good part of the rest of her adult life working. These are some of what these women produced during their years at the clothing factories. A total of 6,000 workers between the late 1930s and mid-1940s produced 38 million worth of garments per year that were sold in the major department stores up and down the East Coast. These were the styles, and they made them right here and in other little communities right outside your door. When the war broke out, some of the companies, the smaller companies that had been struggling, found a whole new source of income. As you can see from this ad that was in the Female Help Wanted column of the local newspaper, for those of us who are a little older, we remember those days. You guys don't even know what newspapers are, that's okay. See, there I go, stereotyping, not good. They produced the military uniforms for the young soldiers who went off to war. You're going to get an interesting side story to that a little later that I'm going to let someone else tell you. And as more and more men enlisted or were drafted into military service, more and more of these women were called into the clothing factories. They were kind of overshadowed by Rosie the Riveter and all the drama of the bomb girls who worked in the other factories. But these were the ones who kept plugging away every day. They would go home at night, get their needles ready for the following day, and continue working. Rose, by this point in time, had graduated to another clothing factory called Hoover's, which was a little further away, but they paid a whole $25 a week in salary. At that point, her father said, "You give me $10 a week for the household, and the rest is yours." Well, Rose, unlike Sister Anna, saw that $15 a week and headed for downtown Vineland to stores like Prince's, where they had the finest in women's clothing, suits and jackets and dresses, and she would go on a weekly spree. You pay a little bit down, pay a little bit a week, and she was one of the best dressed kids on the block. These factories that remained in operation during these years numbered approximately 50. That was the count I arrived at. Now, I'm sure there's going to be others that'll surface if anybody ever pursues this line of research, but that was the number I could find. There were companies like Martin Corporation over in Bridgeton, Hamilton Park, which I'm sure is a familiar name to many people here. And then there was Newell Clothing in Vineland, which is right up the street from my museum, and I go by it every day and shake my head. Should never been allowed to happen. And Topamart, which is also hidden away on a side street in Vineland. For these girls, leaving work at the end of the day, that was when it all started to happen. For a lot of them, once they went home and did their chores or took care of their families, got themselves ready for work the next day, that was when it was time to really enjoy life. But again, it was always within the limitations of the family. In my mother's case, she lived home until she was 25 when she married. Her father wouldn't let her and her sister in the front yard in shorts. But once they were working, they had a friend who had a single mother, and this friend had a car. So the times would come when they could escape and go a little further afield. And they'd go to Atlantic City for a day at the beach. And oh, thank goodness Pop wasn't there to see those bathing suits. Times at home were spent with some of her brothers. That's my mom at the center with the long hair and her sister Anna with her hair pulled back. This was taken in 1945. The second gentleman in there on the left, that's her brother Gus. He had been a prisoner of war during World War II and had just recently been released after 9 months of captivity. So that was definitely cause for celebration as far as the family was concerned. They also would go to Philadelphia, that den of iniquity, and see the Mummers Parade every holiday season. Occasionally, there was a night out at a nightclub, but as they do in most Italian families, we still don't talk about that even today. And of course, the church. Some of you will probably recognize the scene of the Our Lady of Mount Carmel festival that takes place still every year here in Hamilton. Little churches like this had sprung up in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and for many, they were still a focal point of their lives. They continued to work, some of them in the years that followed, even after they got married, which was the highlight of every woman's life in those days. Rose, she stayed on for about 6 months until she found herself pregnant. And she said to my father, "What should I do?" And he said, "It's your decision." She opted to leave work because in those days it wasn't a case of maternity leave and sick time and whatever else you got. You worked, you got paid. You didn't work, bye. We don't see you anymore. So she left that life behind. But for many of them, it was a case of stay on to help. It made all the difference. When the unions came in, the unions did what they could to help the women in the clothing factories. Now, interestingly enough, what you have to understand about the unions here in South Jersey, for these women, the unions were tainted by the ghost of communism, which had been rampant in Italy before their families came here. And the unions were also men's business. So the women did join eventually, but for many of them it was, I don't think I want to get involved. It's not something that shows me as a loyal American if I go off and I do something like this. There was a strike here in Hamilton in 1929, a violent confrontation between the clothing workers, but I was never able to find out exactly where that occurred at. But for other of these women, it was just a case of the union was something they paid their dues to, and if they were lucky, when they finally retired, they were able to collect a whole $80 a month pension, which, as you can imagine, didn't go too far. This is a listing that I gathered of some of the factories, trying to go town to town as much as I could find. Many of them, as I said, are long gone, and they were small plants for the most part. They had only usually one heating unit in a room, which meant the further away you were from that heating unit, the heavier the stockings you have to wear. Fanny Gorgo recalled working at De Rossi Clothes in Vineland. I worked by the window and it was cold there. How many times we had to leave our shoes on, our stockings up, where most of them used to roll them down when it was hot. In the winter, we'd leave the stockings, bring another pair of socks to put on. We only had one furnace in there, and that was it. In addition to the temperature, you had the noise of the machines that was sometimes deafening. Dannenhofer said the pressing machines were right behind me, and that's why I can't hear today. But the thing of it is, there was no recourse for them. It was if you wanted the job, you suffered the conditions. The clothing manufacturers were lauded for providing so much work to local women. In fact, on September 5th, 1942, the Bridgeton Evening News reported that a local company, Landis Park Clothing Company, had been honored with a certification from the Federal Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division to hire 10 learners at an hourly wage below the minimum rates, which was then $1.10, maybe up to $2 an hour. And they also sometimes had to deal with management who had no qualms about going out on the factory floor and saying to the workers, "Oh, I like that gold cross you got there. I'll give you 10 cents. You can buy a loaf of bread for your family on your way home from work tonight." And a lot of times that gold cross or the ring or the bracelet went to somebody else's house that night. But again, it was second to family. It didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. Gorgo actually made $40 a year during the war years. She worked with another girl because they had a specific dream. She wanted to open a diner. So they wound up partnering up to produce as much as they could. But like a lot of young women during that time period, and this I learned from my own mother, it was kind of like, well, I'll go to work this week, you go to work next week, and maybe we'll make enough money, and if we don't, then we can double time the week after. So the clothing company owners also had their hands full when they had a younger workforce. Gorgo's husband, Fanny Gorgo, the girl who wanted to open the diner, would leave their young son with a cousin, and said her husband never objected to her working. Because the other benefit of being in the clothing factory was, in addition to any extra money you earned from your production work, it was a steady income. The farmers couldn't always count on that because the economy was always going up and down and all over the place as far as the goods were concerned. So Fanny said, far from Anthony's objecting to it or resenting her work, she said, he loved it. When I went to work, he stayed home. I got up at dawn, I got the kids' clothes ready. Then my cousin came over to take care of him. I'd tell her what to feed him and if there was anything wrong to call me up. How many days I got a call? And she said she knew it was beneficial to her husband and she knew it was beneficial for the family. Once in a while, though, she'd like to sneak in a little treat, especially in the wintertime. I would buy a 1/4 pound of salami. I would make a sandwich that day and one for the day after. That's what I would eat with water or a cup of coffee. Other ones, like Rita Dannenhofer, whose family life was a blended family. Her father was a widower with 6 kids who married a widow with 4 kids. Every once in a while, she'd go off and she'd buy herself a new pair of black knit stockings, despite the fact that her stepmother would always tell her, bring the paycheck home. And it wound up that they did manage sometimes to save because conditions were starting to change. They worked, many of them, through the war years, and they produced all these goods. But then the war ended, and suddenly these women who were being told, come out into the workplace, we need you, were being told, guess what, girls? It's time to go home. The men are back. And they wound up, many of them doing just that. Jobs that had been exclusively female were taken over by the male workforce that was returning from the war. They didn't mind. They said, the men are back. We'll give way to the men out of respect because that's what they knew. That's what they were taught. It wasn't a matter of being subordinate. It was a matter of being supportive because the men were the technical heads of the family unit. Gorgo eventually earned her $105 a month pension, and with her cousin Marie opened a small diner. She had a leave of absence for 6 months to try it out. She said, "We were there all summer. In the winter, the refrigerator broke, the slicer broke, the freezer went." I said, "What more? I'm going back to the factory." So that's what she did. Downey, looking back, said she was sorry she never had the opportunity to finish high school and aspire toward different goals. She said, "I felt as though I were cheated. But the circumstances were, the war was there, and my parents weren't doing good with the farm. The sewing factory also helped me integrate into American society. That's where I made contact with my friends. That, in fact, was where she met her husband. It was some achievement anyway, so really, that was my passage to life." And the clothing industry itself here in South Jersey, unfortunately, would start to meet its demise, for the most part, by the 1970s, when outsourcing, a word that all of us love to hear, started to occur for most of American industry. As you can see here, Vineland's Newell Clothing Company was still in business, had won a rather significant military contract, but within a few short years, their business was done. Crown Clothing, along with DeRossi & Son, is one of 2 clothing factories that remain in business in Vineland today. And these days, you have women of Hispanic background and of Asian descent sitting at sewing machines that really aren't very much different from the ones that were used so many years ago by the women of Italian descent. And why did they do it? For a very simple reason. They're newcomers to America. And they are newcomers who know the family comes first. You work for the family. And if I work long enough and hard enough in the clothing factory, then maybe my children won't have to. And here she is, 18 years old, freshly graduated from high school. And that's why this talk was created, so that some of the misperceptions about women like my mother will get altered with further time and research, and so that people know she and her generation paved the way out of the clothing factories for me and mine. Thank you.
So I was asked here today to talk a little bit about my aunt, the legacy of this building, and my experiences working for my aunt one summer in 1977 on my journey to try to figure out who I was and what I was allowed to do post the generation that Pat so graciously and shared with us, where I was a first generation, my parents were first generation immigrants from Italy, my mother being from Sicily, and my father was third generation or second generation running a farm in Hamilton. So I grew up on a farm, and a lot of what I experienced while I was growing up was very traditional ideas that Pat went through, explained for the younger people in the audience, which I'm sure, given the stories that you've heard along the way from parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, you do know there's been an evolution in what women have been allowed to do. But back in 1970s, it still was not thought that a young lady could do a whole lot of things. I think we had a very short list. Probably librarian was on it for my parents, that would have passed, or teacher, nurse. It was a short list. My mother, high on my mother's list was bank teller because she couldn't become a bank teller. But Anyway, that's because, if you were to look at old movies and they reference, and you'll see that a lot of those jobs were men in the 40s. My parents grew up in the 30s and 40s. So I am going to regress a little and talk about my aunt a little bit, but I wanted to let you know why they asked me to be here to give my own personal experiences about actually even working here and my aunt and the impression I had when I was here of those wonderful women and men that did work in this factory, and the hum of those machines and the excitement and the pride that you spoke about, that all influenced decisions I needed to make for myself about having a sense of purpose and something that I had wanted to have pride in within myself. But getting back to my aunt was actually born Anna Bertino in Italy. And she migrated here with her parents. I don't know the exact date, but she was at the time one of 3 siblings that had been born in Italy. When they came here, they proceeded to have 4 more children. So she was the first daughter, the eldest daughter. Her father, when he first came to this country, my grandfather, he worked in this building, which at the time was a shoe factory. Okay, so that was, again, not what his purpose in life what he would have liked to have done, but it was more about survival and immigrating and coming across to this great land of opportunity to make a better way for his family. So he ended up again working in a factory like so many other Italian immigrants. So my Aunt Anna, when she was in 6th grade, she too was forced to drop out of school because they needed her to go to work and help support this family that had grown here. And it was through the Depression. There was just a lot going on, and the concerns, again, of the typical Italian-American family, first generation were, and which has been passed on, I might add, to care about the family and put the family first. So it was a big stretch from coming to being an Italian-American immigrant, having to quit school, to catapulting herself into a position where she decided to purchase this garment factory in 1962. A little bit about my aunt. At the time, she was married and had 2 children, 2 daughters. And my uncle, her husband, had come down with a serious debilitating disease that could no longer allow him to continue being the breadwinner, and it was part of her spirit to go beyond just the roles of what women were expected at that time, and it was pretty gutsy. And as a 6-year-old niece, knowing that she had purchased, it was just something to look up to, you know. So, as I said, my aunt purchased this building in 1962 and ran it for a little over 20 years. Can you hear me? Am I like going in and out of this? Okay, thank you. So during that time period, as her niece and and she had several extended nieces, including my sister-in-law in the audience, we all shared the glory of being able to get brand new coats every year. And given that I was the tallest in the family of my cousins, I traditionally every year when I reached a certain age, around 12 or 13, had to come in and try on and model all the new women's coats that were being sent out for that year's fashions. So that was quite exciting, and I usually end up walking away with more like 3 or 4 coats, but those were good days, good times. I just lost my train of thought, excuse me. So anyway, getting back to when I reached a certain age, we started working on the farm locally, and a lot of people have had that experience in this audience. And because my parents owned the farm, and his brother and his wife, we, as children, were allowed to work on it as early as 12 years old. There were no laws for farming communities. And I mention this because we did get to go to work at a very young age and actually put in those long, hard days. But one of the things that I believe that gifted me was the understanding of knowing how to work and how to commit to putting into something you love and having a lot of pride in the outcome. And my parents taught me that, and my siblings and my cousins that worked side by side for many long hours, 7 days a week, between 9 and 11 hours a day, and all summer long. So when I was contemplating what do I want to be when I grew up, my parents, and actually my father, being first generation, felt that it was his decision. And this is in the 70s, you know. But it was a part of that mindset that, you know, that again, you stick together, you think about the best possible journey for your children as well as yourself, and that part of that journey was to let your children know what you felt the best for their outcome so that they can make a future. So hence, again, those made sense, like becoming a teacher or a nurse, a secretary, a bank teller. These are all glorious professions, and believe me, I couldn't be a nurse. I'm scared of blood. I hate numbers. I have no patience to sit and be somebody's secretary. But again, these were my interests were in the arts. And that really didn't gel very well with my parents because, again, in the spirit of wanting the best for me, they thought that wasn't a great decision because starving artist was, you know, one of those, misconceptions that they had in their mind. And so they set on a journey which included trying to figure out what the best thing for me to do would be given, you know, what they wanted to see me become. And if it wasn't going to be a nun, which my father really would have liked me to have been because he thought I'd make a very attractive sister superior. So they sat on this journey to figure out what I was going to become. And I was like, I don't know, but panicked because I couldn't be anything but who I was. And anyway, my Aunt Anna had a niece who was in the merchandising business, and they knew that I had an interest in fabrics and materials, and I had possibly considered wanting to go away to school to learn about fabrics, which was far out to them, but more conceivable than going to be an artist. At least I could maybe position myself in the garment industry and somehow. And their cousin Jill had established herself. Today she still works for Gap in New York, and she's a buyer that goes all over the world. And at the time she was working for Macy's. And so they thought, well, let's put Liz in contact with Jill, and she can spend a summer working at Aunt Anna's shop and see if she enjoys working in this industry. So that's what I did in the summer of 1977, spring and summer. I came to work at my aunt's shop, and I actually sat at a table with women who turned inside right, sleeves, collars, and everything that was made on these sewing machines by these incredibly spirited, competitive women that I had the opportunity to spend some time with. Now, I have to tell you, and this is just a little sidebar, because back then, seriously, because we have so many opportunities today and it's almost blurred, but I was really scared that I'd have to go be something that I couldn't be, and that was scary, Again, like I said, I couldn't handle the sight of blood. I mean, I had this long list, and I just didn't seem to be, I've seemed to be a square peg trying to fit into a round circle in my family's world. So I was almost at the borderline feeling desperate to be heard, to be understood, to be recognized that I will use whatever talents God gave me to the best of my ability, but you have to just let them be what it is I feel like I could be, because how could I go do something I can't be? So anyway, getting back to coming here, it was one of the wonderful experiences I had working that summer. With these, again, like I said, my aunt, who was, she was someone I looked up to. She was a woman before her time. She had broken a lot of the good old boy ceilings, if I could use that phrase, back in the day, in the 30s or the 40s and 50s, my aunt served on many committees to help build the town and shape the direction. She served for the Kessler Memorial Hospital, both in the fundraising and efforts to get it built. Then she was on their board of directors and also served as the president. So you can see why I'm looking up to her. And again, she just exemplified qualities of strength and sincerity for and passion for what it is that she did. And she was a very stoic woman in a lot of ways too, because she was focused on the goal, but all the time doing this to take care of her family, picking up the pieces where her husband could no longer do, and providing for her children and her children's children and some of the extended family, as well as her sister worked for her as a floor manager, and a few of her nephews. So again, it was all about providing. And so as a young girl, understanding all of this, wanting to obey my parents, and wanting them to know that I really cared about what I became and what they thought, It was nice to go to a place where I saw these spirited, independent women at these machines, and just as Pat has mentioned, they were competitive, they had a pride in their work, and it was all about that. It was about how good they could do something. A spirit that I really wish I could see today mirrored in our communities and this is not to, get high on a horse or point a finger, but it is disappointing in some ways that we've kind of crumbled from this, the level of integrity that used to be held in the workforce. And that's what they exemplified for me. So I did want to share. And in that, Rosie the Riveter was about those lovely women that were in the factories creating stuff for the war. I saw it as a young woman as all those women who worked in the workforce to bring up the views a little higher so that we could be welcomed and share jobs that men enjoyed at the same level of emotional contentment, and there were plenty of women that opened up doors, and I feel these women opened up doors. So I just wanted to put this up. I don't have a slideshow. I do have some samples of my work in the back, which I'll get to. She's been my hero, and it's been in my video. Rosie the Riveter. So I had to take her along today because she's been with me for years, and it's her spirit that we can do this. So anyway, fast forward, I eventually was allowed to become a fashion merchandiser, again, like Jill, who made a very successful way for herself in the world. But, and I was accepted to Drexel University College, and there, I had a wonderful guidance counselor who could hear that I actually didn't want to be a fashion merchandiser. I was very much a tomboy. I grew up on a farm. I raced trucks with boys on back roads. No one, and but my parents again had decided that this would look good. You're tall, you can carry clothing. They thought this would get me out of t-shirts and jeans. So, but anyway, I agreed to it because it would be freedom from the farm, in that I loved the farm. But the guidance counselor there recognized that I, in fact, was not at all interested in fashion merchandising, and recognized that I, in fact, wanted to go to art school, and asked my mother what was she so afraid of if we actually sent your daughter to the school that she wanted to go to and become what she wanted to become, and which was a brave thing for that woman to do. I mean, she was my mother's same age, around my mother, but she had chosen a career, and my mother was a housewife, and very concerned with putting a wonderful future in front of her daughter's life that she can actually make a living at. And they were, again, concerned about the arts. So this woman showed my mother all the materials we were looking at, including the college catalog and advertisements. And she told my mother, who do you think did all this? Who do you think the layout artist was, or the photographer, or the illustrator, or the writer? Those are all people in the arts, and they affect you every day. And she spoke to my mother about a few other things that, she could recognize. And then I was finally allowed to have it be considered. But what we had to do, which my father was waiting in the car downstairs, we had to wait till we got over the bridge and we were very close to Hamilton before we could bring it up to him, because he might not really sit well with him, to go against what he felt was the best decision for me. Again, first generation Italian-American farmer, So again, I really do credit the experience I had and my aunt bringing to light the idea that she could possibly do something in the arts with fabric, and that is a viable, that there could be things out there for her to do, and shared this experience with me to allow me to work for her. And watch all these incredible women who loved what they did and had a passion for it, and a passion and just like Pat mentioned, they stayed over machines for hours on end, and they never skipped a beat. Along with chattering, they loved to talk, and what they could over the machines, you would hear some of these voices where they would get into a conversation, and they had to compete with the hum of the machine. But I'm happy to say that to wrap this up and this experience, I was allowed to go off and become who I wanted to be, and I ran a photography business for 30 years. I had to stop not a little while ago, about 3 years ago, due to a serious back injury. But in that time that I've been off, and just trying to keep connected to my work and some of my original passions, I started turning some of my personal photography into fabric. So I've actually come full circle. And I have some samples of that in the back if you'd like to see. But a funny little anecdote story about bringing everything all together. I had an intern from Stockton the last year I was closing my business in 2011. And the intern who loved my ideas for fabrics. She said, well, Liz, get them printed. And in my mind, all I could see were these huge bolts of fabric because I worked here. And to the best of my knowledge, who's going to print my little fabrics for a sample? They print them in bolts, and that's way too much fabric, especially if I don't like the design. So anyway, she got on the computer, and within 20 minutes we had an order to a company, and so again, the beauty of technology, the beautiful beauty of generations meeting and helping one another, and leading one another on that path that we call life, So I just want to thank you. I want to thank Pat, too, for giving a wonderful introspective view into these women and the world that they proudly conquered. Because believe me, when I was out in the force, when I first got started, I felt a lot of those pangs of being people expecting male photographers to show up or a male to be doing one thing, and I was always actually initially seen as the assistant, and I'd have to be like, no, I'm actually the photographer. So and there were plenty of women in that business that I ended up in initially, which was public relations in Philadelphia, that paved the way so that I could actually be a vendor that was a woman working independently. So they were all around, and that's why I love this Rosie the Riveter, because she, to me, represents the spirit of women and all that we've had to go through to fight the good fight of just being recognized as equal partners. So thank you.
So Pat was introduced to someone who has a short little anecdote about their meeting with the gentleman with the jacket. So please come on up. Well, you can, okay. I know her well.
Take over the talking part. To all of you, I lived this. I was a bookkeeper.
My name is Susan Curcio. Standing next to me is my mother, Lucy Curcio. Lucy is 89 years old. She's going to talk to you for a few moments about her work at the Newell Clothing Factory, which was mentioned in Pat's remarks. I'm the emotional support.
As Susan said, I'm Lucy Curcio. I'm 89 years old. My husband is a World War II veteran, unfortunately now living in the Veterans Home in Vineland. He's 94 years old. He served the war, and I was a bookkeeper and secretary at the Newell Clothing Factory. And the mayor of our town was the owner of the business, and when a man came home for a leave, they would have a big dinner, and he invited Sam to come to the factory to get fitted for an Eisenhower jacket. And this is it. It was manufactured then in May of 45, I believe it was. So he went on into service. He was a major. Then he came home and went to law school. He was in the New Jersey State Assembly. And the way he tells the story, he was responsible for Stockton getting here to South Jersey. So I thought you might all be interested in that. Thank you.
My mom indicated that she was working as a bookkeeper at the Newell Clothing Factory. They were making those Eisenhower jackets on government contract at the time. As you can see from the drab green, that's clearly military uniform. And my dad went to the factory to have his jacket fitted. There he met my mother, and you saw on the board, I believe, that the Newell Clothing Factory was at 7th and Quince in Vineland. And they met there at the clothing factory, had met earlier in Hamilton, which was both of their homes, and they went out for lunch at the from the Newell Clothing Factory to lunch on the street in Vineland, and the rest is history. I also was the Italian-American daughter from Hamilton. If anybody's interested, I would fill in my story in the back of the room to people who have questions, because that's a story for another day. But thank you all for entertaining my mother's remarks. And if you want to see the jacket closer up, we'll have it in the back of the room. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I did want to mention that just behind me is this authentic sewing machine that we like to call the Works, and it was donated by the Cucci family in memory of their mother. Perhaps some of you may have known her, Mary Cucci. And the family recently sold their home on Bellevue, And literally, my colleague was driving by and saw them removing some things, and he quickly called me and said, Eileen, I think there's a sewing machine. And I'm like, let's get in the buggy and get that thing. And this really is the spirit of the building, and we really can't celebrate it. And those of you who came to tell your stories, share your stories, it's just wonderful. Are there any other stories in the, yes, please, come on up. I also wanted to add that my students from my gender equity in class are here, and they probably have a question or two maybe Miss Allison would like to represent. Come on up, please.
Hi, my name is Joanna Kahn. My mother was Gertrude Presti, and our neighbor was Anna Bertino. We lived on Packard Street, and also the Curcios, by the way, were neighbors. We lived on Packard Street, and Anna, I remember as a child, had a phenomenal work ethic, as many women did in those days, because it was the way to survive. And one of the things that she did was file income tax for people. And it was always around this time of the year. I remember my mother's taking me by the hand, usually in the afternoon, and say, okay, we have to go down to Anna's and file income tax. As a young child, I had no idea what filing income tax was. However, I would go, and Anna's daughter, Jean, would be there, and we were approximately the same age. And so Jean and I would sit in the living room and keep ourselves busy while the two mothers sat at the table and took care of the business at hand. That being said, my mother came from the Adriatic Sea of Italy, approximately the center from a town called Campobasso, in which their main way of earning a living was the olive oil business. My father, on the other hand, came from Sicily, and that little hilltop town, I believe, was in Castanea, where they were farmers. So you wonder how farmers and olive oil people kind of get together and somehow or another find a common ground. And the common ground was, in our particular case, the clothing industry. So when Mom married my dad, she was 19 years old, and prior to that was working in Philadelphia, because that's where she was born and raised, and she had to quit school at a very young age to go work in a clothing factory and sew, hand sew. She was taught how to hand sew, which was an art in those days, and she carried that with her when they got married, and she moved to Hamilton and spent the rest of her life here. That being said, directly behind our house on Packard Street was Kessler Clothing. And so Mom got a job there part-time because she was always, as many women not only were, but I think currently are today, multitask. And so she would make sure in the morning that we were dressed and fed and off to school, and then she would just go out the back door to the side door into Kessler Clothing and sew for several hours, but always be home in time to greet us at the door. So in a sense, we never really knew she was out there earning a living, but she was. And she was a wonderful artist, and she always did hand sewing. And Mr. Kessler was very, very kind to her. And he would always select her to do special orders. And so my mom sewed coats for Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin and Jackie Gleason and Sammy Davis Jr. and that whole Rat Pack and many other famous people. But she would write a little note when she finished their coat, and she'd put it in there, hello, my name is Gertrude Presti, and I live at blah, 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 and I just want you to know that every stitch in this coat was done with love and admiration. And so she'd include this little note in every famous person's coat. And so one day we get a letter from a PR person of Jackie Gleason's, telling us how much he loved the coat. And he wasn't a skinny guy. And there were a lot of stitches that she had to put into that coat. So, he just praised her, and he said, if you ever get to New York, I'd like you to come see my show, et cetera, et cetera. I searched and searched and searched for that letter. I could never find it. I'm sure it got misplaced. But whatever it was, that really was the highlight of her career, being in contact with someone that was so famous. And so Mom continued to work at Kessler, and She also belonged to the union, by the way, and Mr. Kessler used to have wonderful holiday parties for he really, really appreciated the people that worked for him. He brought many Italians over to work in his shop, and he was very good and he was very generous to them. He provided housing for them because there is just such a magnificent, talented group of people. You just do not find tailors like that today. One of the things that I did was my mother, I used to work in the fields, believe it or not, 6, 7 years old. By the time I was 8 years old, I had to go to the Hamilton News to get a job. And at that time, that was around the corner, across the street from the current Noise Museum. There's this little building. And I would go there after school on Thursday, and I had my little cloth carrier bag, which I carried in my books during the day, and then I brought with me, and they would load it up with newspapers, and I would go into Kessler's shop with these newspapers over my shoulder, and they would see me and they'd go, here she comes, because they were so excited to get the Hamilton News. And so I would go to each one, it was a nickel. And who would give me a dime, who would give me a quarter, etc. And I would sell the Hamilton News in the clothing shop. And I was always in awe of these women with their all bent over, chattering, but working very hard. And you could see over the years, because I got to know them all quite well, I spent a lot of time in there, and you could see the deterioration due to the stress put on their bodies. From the type of work that they did. And I remember I used to look at their hands. I was always wondering about their hands because they were their instruments. And I remember seeing them with fingers like this. And I'd say to myself, oh my God, that's what happens to you when you do that kind of work. Well, I don't ever want to do that kind of work. Never taken into consideration the genealogy that goes with it. And so now I have this finger, I never sew a button. But at any rate, I did find in my collection a very interesting picture. So anyone who has worked for Kessler Hospital and can help clothing, and can help me identify some of these women. I have this here, and perhaps I do have most of the names, but if you can help me, we will do this. And that's basically all I have to say. It's been a wonderful town with really, really people that everybody should be proud of, because not all of us, came from the upper echelon. So it was really good. It was a good thing. Okay.
Well, how nicely. We have another anecdote. Please come up. I'm sorry to be here. The microphone holder.
I'm going to follow along with William B. Kessler. My father was my name is Anna Ebinger. My father was one of the original cutters of William B. Kessler's. I think I'm following. Mr. Kessler taught my father, and he had a factory in New York. And we hadn't even started school, and we were 3 children. My father was working in New York City with Mr. Kessler. So when he moved to Hamilton, of course, my father was what they call a bandsaw cutter, meaning that he would cut. He had a spiral cutting machine, and he would cut 50 suits. And you had Mr. Kessler's was men's clothing. Like she said, very excellent suits. And then the brand came, Hamilton Park, came from Kessler. It was a brand they chose to use. And even presidents used those suits. But then, of course, like everything else, it was outsourced, especially when the son-in-law took over and the business went down. And I just want to note, I found the clothing union from New York. He used to go to New York, my father, at least once a month. It was very powerful, just the Cutters Union. He was initiated in that in 1934. That's 80 years ago. You're welcome.
So I'd like to, please.
Thank you. I won't take too long. I just wanted to tell you I am from Vineland. My name is Rita Travaglione Wood. I always said the best thing about getting married was just 4 letters instead of 11. But just to give you a little history, because my whole family were in the clothing factory. My mother was from Landisville, and she worked at Sperania's in Model Blouse, along with all her sisters. And the same thing is true. They brought that paycheck home and gave it to Dad, right? Okay. And my father's side was from Malaga, and his sisters worked in Vineland at the clothing factory. And I remember DeRossi and Crown Clothing. And I'm sure I have articles and photographs in my mother's stuff, so I will get it to you. But just I was nodding the entire time she was talking because it was telling my family story. And I want the young people to understand this. My mother was living, she would be 96 years old. So all her sisters were would be in their 90s or in their hundreds. I'm sure Aunt Mary could not read or write, and she worked in the clothing factory. And now I think, I should have paid more attention, because my aunt had some kind of a system that she used to track how much, like sometimes they had to take buttonholes and they go home and they work. She had some kind of a paper system to keep track of all her work, because easily you could be taken over if you can't read or write. But the one last point that I want to tell the young people, I was going to go to college. I was the first girl in our family, both mother's side and father's side, to go to college, and this was in 1962. And it's just as I can remember it now. Seeing my Italian uncles in the family, everybody's at the house, and my uncles are saying to my father, "What are you going to send Rita to college for? She's only going to get married," right? And my father's answer, never will forget it, "I want her to go to college because I don't want her to work in a clothing factory like my wife, Carmela, and my sisters." So I thought he was a very strong man to have me go off to college, but I had to be the teacher. No, and I am a home ec teacher. So in a way, I still have that clothing because I taught clothing construction at Delsey Regional in Franklinville, and then I went on to Rutgers University and did community education. So clothing is in my blood.
Talk about threading it all together. Look at the stories. They just keep coming. Please do.
I really...
Please. Okay, I'll stand up here with you. This is my new friend.
My name is Joanne Mathis. My mother was Anna Intosimoni from Waterford, New Jersey, and she went to 6th grade. Exactly. I just nodded my head all through. It's just my family. And I'm very proud of my mom. She would be 101 years old now. But she could drive. In fact, she taught my father to drive because she was born on a farm. And as soon as she was old enough, she went to 6th grade, she came to work in Kessler Factory. And she had riders who gave her 50 cents a week. And, she was the cat's meow, I guess. And and my dad saw her, and she saw my dad. Wow, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Kessler Clothing. It was instantaneous, quickly. So I was in high school. Mommy worked in Kessler's shop, worked, had her babies, went back to work, and with Daddy. Dad was in Kessler's factory too. They raised us. Kessler's factory raised us, 3 of us. My 2 brothers, my younger brother, yeah. And it was a very happy childhood. We were a medium family, worked hard for everything. That's our ethnic, and it's good. But anyway, I'm not going to keep you long. I was in high school, and there was a lady, Mrs. Camerata, on the street behind us, and she sold dresses for $3 a piece. And Mommy took me there and bought me dresses and bought her dresses. And the lady said, "Ann, you have a good personality. You work in the shop. Take 6 dresses for $3. You sell them for 6. And then look at the money you made. Well, Anne, God bless her, she took the dresses. She went back and got more dresses with the money. Put a rack in her upstairs in the bedroom, and people would go up there and buy Mommy's clothes, okay? And, okay, from the rack in the bedroom, there was a rack in the basement. Then she closed in her, this is 501 12th Street, 503 12th Street, Ann's Dress Shop, Hamilton, New Jersey, for 50 years in Hamilton. Proud of my mom. God bless you, Mommy. I hope you hear me. But, aren't I a mess? But anyway, yes. That's to my mom, and her name was Ann too. It's Ann's today, yes.
There's another guest? Thank you. That's a very colorful story. I think we have enough for a screenplay here. Is there another guest that would like to make some comments? Okay. Well, I guess that rounds up. I'd like to thank Patrick, my intern from Stockton, for setting up this event, and of course our distinguished guest speaker. Let's hear it for Pat Martinelli, our beautiful and authentic anecdotes from Liz Woolerman, and all of the guests who participated. Thank you. Bon appetit. There's some nice food behind you. Manja, manja. I'm in the wrong continent. And have a great evening.